So thank you guys for coming out tonight. We're really excited to be here. I can tell you there's no one who knows the ins and outs of Congress and the DC political landscape like these two guys over here to my right. I worked on Capitol Hill for over 10 years, and the institutional knowledge that these two gentlemen bring to the table is quite astounding. We'd like this to be a little bit interactive, so I'm going to go to questions fairly quickly tonight, but obviously when we started planning this thing out in the fall, we thought, like, hey, February might be an interesting time to do it. Maybe there'll be a couple things to talk about. You know, the primary's going to be going on. Maybe this impeachment thing will be going somewhere. We didn't all realize it would be a giant collision in the last 10 days, and so I don't think we have a shortage of things to discuss tonight, so I think we're pretty eager to jump in, so I'm going to do that.
It's just a coincidence we're here for a basketball game. Just saying.
And the retirement of Archie's number.
Yeah.
So that's pretty big.
We need to see a little more blue.
I got blue on. They're holding out for years. So those who know Paul know he has a very close relationship with one of the presidential candidates on the Democratic side. He's covered Joe Biden for a long time. Paul went to the University of Delaware, so he has a little bit of affinity for the senator. But if someone was to write a biography of Joe Biden, there'd be no better person to do it than Paul. So I'm going to start off by asking Paul, the media narrative is that Biden is dead. And do you agree with that? And where do you place his position in the race right now?
Biden has been the front runner since, probably sometime in 2018 when people started doing polls about the race. And the assumption was that he was leading all along just because he had the most name ID, that people did not know they couldn't pronounce the mayor of South Bend's last name, they didn't know who Cory Booker was, and that eventually he would fade away. But throughout 2019, he just kept hanging on. There was a resiliency there, and it was largely because he has such great support among the African American community. And he has always thought that if he can just get to the South Carolina primary, where I think 60% of voters are African American, particularly older African Americans that really appreciate his service as Barack Obama's vice president and know him from his days as a senator. And then on to Super Tuesday, where places like Alabama, Arkansas are in play. His problem has always been, though, how do you get from Iowa to South Carolina? It's on the calendar, it only looks like 26 days, February 3rd to February 29th. But what he's realized is that, the Iowa caucuses are dominated by white liberals who have been drifting more toward Bernie Sanders. New Hampshire, Bernie Sanders, next door neighbor of New Hampshire coming from Vermont. So, and then on top of all of it was the impeachment trial in which for almost a week straight, the president's defense team put Joe Biden and his son Hunter Biden basically on trial as their defense, and the Biden campaign had just almost no explanation for it. He, when asked about it by reporters, would say things like, everyone's looked into this, but nobody's found anything wrong. It's a very bad answer. It kind of makes you sound like, nobody's found anything wrong yet. And he could never explain forcefully what his son was doing on the board of this Ukrainian energy company. And you had on top of that just day after day of the president's legal team pounding away at him. And I think toward the end, for voters in Iowa, they just looked at him as an older guy who they weren't sure could take on Trump, who Trump would beat up the way he did Hillary. And he just collapsed in the final days in Iowa. And then that just fed this feeding frenzy, and you saw it last night where he ends up in single digits. Now he's in South Carolina, and he thinks he can still win South Carolina, but it's still, what's today's date? February 12th. We still got 17 more days to get to this time where they'll finally get some South Carolina votes in, and the oxygen is harder and harder to get to South Carolina. Don't ever count the guy out. That's one thing that everybody should have learned over the years. Nobody has a right to use the Rocky theme song quite like Joe Biden, the way he has gone through personal and political travails, but it's much more uphill now than it was 2 weeks ago, dramatically much more uphill than it was 4 weeks ago.
And those spirals in campaigns are so tough to come out of, because not only are you grasping for airtime when the media is kind of portraying you as dead in the water, but fundraising dries up. And as a candidate, Joe Biden has fundraising problems on a grassroots level. He's got big dollar donors who are pretty much maxed out at this point, but he doesn't have a big grassroots network. So that spiral can really catch up with a campaign. And those amount of days, it doesn't sound like a lot in the real world, but in politics, that is
Yeah,
terrible.
primaries are so mercurial. They turn on one or two things right at the moment, right? So the moment was Saturday night, I guess. Amy Klobuchar had a good debate. So Amy Klobuchar all of a sudden is getting the press, and Joe feels...
Raised $5 million, I think, in about 4 or 5 days.
Yeah, so Joe Biden feels a little old at this point. I think he's got real problems. He's counting on Jim Clyburn, who's from South Carolina, the number 3 person in the House, to sort of carry him through this, but I think he's in real trouble, and the dynamics are shifting very quickly in this. But before I go on, I just wanted to thank that gentleman for reading a print paper when we walked in, because it really
Thanks, Scott.
it warmed our heart. So thank you.
My
for
wife
that.
accuses me of trying to keep the print media in business.
Well, thank you. Someone has to do that.
So I actually floated this by you a little bit earlier today. I worked in Republican politics before I worked at Politico. I worked on Capitol Hill, sparring with these guys a little bit, a time or two. And before I went over into the media business, I also ran campaigns in the Senate and worked on presidential campaigns. And it's not an exact comparison, but the Biden presence in this race feels very similar to Jeb Bush's presence in the Republican race in 2015 and 16. And what I mean by that is they're not really similar candidates, but there's like a wet blanket effect around Biden where he's sort of preventing other candidates from catching fire. Like right now, you see a shift. Klobuchar is gaining a little wind, but really Booker was unable to catch fire. Julian Castro was unable to catch fire. Kamala Harris was unable to really go anywhere. And Biden's really blocked that like mainstream Democratic lane. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I do. I think that's really a great point. But Jeb and Joe actually are similar. They're these big political names that everyone presumed was going to be the nominee just by virtue that they've been around forever and they've got the contacts and the operation. So everybody's thinking, well, these other folks aren't going anywhere. But, you know, this is a different time in politics. I mean, who would have thought Mayor Pete, or ex-Mayor Pete, as I guess we should call him, because he's not mayor anymore, but he probably would not like to be called ex-Mayor Pete. A guy like that. So is this the Obama model, where here's Obama, comes out of Iowa, no one really knew who he was, and had a strange name, and was a great orator, and so is Pete that kind of person who could really take this over? Seems inexperienced to us, but is he less inexperienced than Obama was at that time? I just think politics is so volatile right now that you really can't tell. But I will say this about, Paul and I talk to a lot of Democrats in Washington every day and a lot of Republicans, and the Democrats are really worried in Washington right now. Yeah. I mean, they are not sure who their nominee is going to be, and they are trying to figure it out. And Mike Bloomberg, talk about looming over the race, is starting to loom over the race in a different way than he had been. I think he just moved up to 3rd in national polls, which are sort of meaningless, but they do show that spending a lot of money really makes a difference. I mean, Tom Steyer even, who's not done much at all to break through, but in South Carolina, I think he's spent a lot of money, and he's making noise down there too. But politics, you know, it used to be that things would just, you could kind of see it developing and play out over months and months and months. Now it just changes all the time.
Yeah, and the biggest difference between Jeb Bush and Biden was that Jeb Bush, he began to fade within a couple of weeks of Trump and Melania going down the escalator. He was, you know, as he was heading into Iowa, he was already in 4th or 5th place and battling with Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio. Biden just sort of hung out there, and his decline is much more quickly.
But I would argue that in some ways because he hung on longer than people would have
Yeah.
expected him to, because they so wanted somebody who the party is telling them is the person to beat Trump. Because
Yes.
he can win Pennsylvania, he can win Wisconsin, Michigan. So that kept him up there, and it probably artificially inflated him. So the dive is
Yeah.
repulsive, is steep.
But, you know, the real problem for Democrats is there still is a fracturing. Bernie has been sort of kind of tied for first in Iowa and just barely in first in New Hampshire. Normally, that's rocket fuel. Normally, the race would be over. But Bernie Sanders won with the smallest percentage of the vote ever in the New Hampshire primary. He's under 26% of the vote. So he's barely getting a quarter of the vote. And now Democrats are panicked because the more that plays out, people only get sort of this many delegates in each race. And the more that plays, Super Tuesday is a huge collection on March 3rd of votes. And if they all splinter, the math becomes determinative and nobody will have enough votes to be the nominee, and then you head into the convention.
Which is every reporter's dream, by the
Yeah.
way. A brokered
Exactly.
convention. We've been expecting a brokered convention forever, and it's never happened. I can't imagine that it would happen, but maybe it has to happen this time. Our politics are upside down.
So you had mentioned volatility, and you can't predict politics because outside the box things are just coming true more often than we've ever seen before. How real is Michael Bloomberg in your mind?
I think he's real. I talked to a lot. Nancy Pelosi at her press conference today said very positive things about Michael Bloomberg. And Nancy Pelosi is nothing if she's not really good at reading what's going on out there for her side. I talk to Democrats all the time. I can see him being Washington's candidate. I can see Washington
He's
Democrat.
100% Washington.
Huh?
Yeah.
He's 100% Washington.
I can see that. Chuck Schumer, his wife was in Bloomberg's cabinet.
Yeah,
I think
transportation
they have a good relationship.
administrator?
Transportation secretary, which seems to be a thing for politicians' wives.
Mrs. McConnell.
Yeah. So I hear a lot of Bloomberg in Washington. Is he the savior? But does Bloomberg connect out there? You're starting to see the Oppo dumps on Bloomberg, which aren't good. But he is also kind of the person I think Democrats want to take on Trump, because he takes them on a personal level, right? Trump put out that thing about wants to stand on a box, and Bloomberg's press secretary comes back and says Trump's a pathological liar. He lies about his obesity, his bad hair, and something else, right? So they're ready. Mike Bloomberg, it's worth going to look back if you're interested in Bloomberg. It's worth going back to look at his speech at the 2016 convention. He gave one of the most blistering critiques of Trump from the perspective of another really rich dude from New York, and like that Trump was a phony rich dude. In fact, wasn't his line from somebody the other day? They said, "What do you think about two New York billionaires being in the presidential race?" He said, "Who's the other one?" Right. So that I think there's people in Washington now. They just don't want Bernie. You tell me they do.
No, because their majority, the congressional majority, the House majority was built in a lot of communities like this, in the Philadelphia suburbs, and they finally think they can beat Brian Fitzpatrick, who's the last Republican in this area up in Bucks County. But I know Brian Fitzpatrick would love for the Democrats to nominate Bernie. Bloomberg. The thing about him that's going really well right now is he's spending astronomical money on ads. He's spending them in smart ways. He is not a warm and cuddly guy. If you watch the ads during a Sixers game, a Flyers game, whatever, notice how little he talks, how little there is of him. They're like soaring rhetoric ads and people who were teachers or firefighters in New York City talking about him. Tom Steyer's problem is he is also a super rich dude who isn't warm and cuddly, and all of his ads are him telling you what's wrong with what's going on, and that's why he's had the same struggle. But Bloomberg's eventual problem is he's got to be out in public. He's got to go to debates. He has to show, and there's a declining value of money at a certain point. How many of you saw the Hillary Clinton children ad where they're looking at the TV and it's Trump? You all know the ad. How many of you saw it 100 times? You probably all saw it 300 times. Eventually, the ad loses its value. So Bloomberg, the money is going to get him up to here, but to get the nomination, it's going to take more than just money.
Well, and it was interesting, too, that with there was a lot of complaints that the DNC was changing its debate requirements to make it easy to get Bloomberg in. But the other candidates want that. They want to get on the stage with Bloomberg. Right now, he's floating out there with these ads, doing his events, carefully scripted. They want to be able to mix it up with him.
And Bernie especially.
Yeah. He's like a mystical character right now.
He's a mystical,
he's
really
known,
rich guy.
He's not known for his debate prowess either.
No, I know I've only met Mayor Bloomberg maybe once or twice. I don't really know him at all. But my impression of people like that is they certainly don't like to be challenged because they're really not used to that. So, but it is funny in this giant country, right? Giant country that two guys from New York. That's what we're talking about.
Well, the third, Bernie.
Yeah. Who actually is from New York.
Yeah, you have the three of the boroughs covered right now. You've got Brooklyn, Queens with Trump, and Manhattan with, does anybody have a Staten Island presidential candidate to launch? I mean,
what is Grimm up
You-
he's out of prison.
Inside joke there.
I'm going to get off of the primary for just a second. I'm sure it'll come back up when we get to Q&A. Obviously, last week was a bit of a grind for reporters up on Capitol Hill who are covering the impeachment. Carl has covered the impeachment of another president in the past.
Not Andrew Johnson.
Not Andrew Johnson. You just missed it.
Yeah.
You just
Close.
You said something earlier that I thought was interesting. It's that despite the fact that impeachment was getting 24/7 cable TV coverage, despite the fact that both parties were extremely dug in on either side of this issue, unlike other controversial things in the last 20 years, whether it be the lead up to the Iraq War, whether it be the financial crisis, whether it's the Tea Party movement, or you saw a lot about healthcare, Obamacare passage, where you saw like citizens show up at the Capitol and organize protests on either side of an issue, it was relatively silent in Washington other than the people who do this for a living. You didn't see a ton of people coming from across the country to weigh in. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I was struck by it. I think we both were, that there wasn't this big public awakening or arousal on either side. And maybe that's because everybody knew where it was going and it's just going to be there. But still, usually people show up. I would walk, I live right down the street from the Capitol. I'd walk up there. There'd be like 4 people every day out there protesting, all against Trump. And I just wasn't sure how much this was connecting out there in the country. And it was, if you turn on the TV, even the usually bad camera angles for watching the Senate were just changed to make it as boring and as less interesting as possible. I don't know that this is going to be, in November, people are even going to be talking about it. I don't know if this is going to be a big thing. I think so many other things can happen. As a major Republican political figure in the Capitol said to me recently, long wait in November.
That's a Mitch McConnell impression if you didn't get it.
But you just don't.
Mine's a little lower.
You just don't. Yeah, you could actually. It is lower.
Yeah.
I don't know. It was odd. I have a brother who's been radicalized by Trump, and he had been talking.
I have some sisters.
Yeah, well, I have
One of whom
several.
might be here.
But and he'd always wanted, I'm coming out for the impeachment. I'm coming out for the impeachment. And I said,
Wait, radicalized in which way?
against Trump.
Against Trump.
Against Trump. And yeah. and it's unusual and for him to be that interested in something. And even I said, well, I can't probably get you in there, but you can come out and hang out in front of the Capitol and yell stuff. And even he didn't take me up on it. So.
Yeah. Well, the contrast is October 2018. The Brett Kavanaugh confirmation is happening in the throes of Me Too. There's lots of rumors going around about an allegation. It turns out Dr. Christine Blasey Ford had been talking to one of my coworkers for several weeks. We published the story on a Sunday. They have to have another hearing. The Capitol for 2 weeks was a cauldron. Every day there were 2,000 people outside. There were hundreds of people inside yelling at senators on one side or another. The vote on Kavanaugh inside the Senate chamber, I think 15 people got hauled out for protesting, trying to disrupt the vote. Over the entire 3.5 weeks of the Senate impeachment trial, one person got arrested for trying to disrupt the thing. This is a guy who is so well known in Congress. As soon as he started screaming, I knew his voice.
Yeah.
Because
Perpetual.
he was in a tree at Obama's second inauguration, about 50 feet away.
identified him too.
Yeah, we just knew him instantly.
No, I said to somebody, I was doing something else, and I said to somebody, who was that? And they go, it was the tree guy.
Yeah.
And, yeah, it was very kind of,
Yeah, so
so,
I
and
don't know.
compared to healthcare too, I mean, we were all there for that. This was a huge protest outside. I mean, thousands of people made it hard.
On the conservative side.
Yeah, on the conservative side, made it very hard. You probably helped motivate some of those people. Made it very hard to, for people to even, Democratic members to walk to the Capitol. It was very tense, but
Yeah.
there was none of that this time.
Yeah.
So on impeachment, it's interesting. For those who are not aware, the Capitol is a great place to be a reporter because you can roam at will. You can find senators and congressmen in the hall to do hallway interviews. You find staff. And when you're dealing with 100 offices in the Senate and over 400 in the House, there's always someone with something to say, and there's always an interesting angle to pursue. It's probably the best place to be a beat reporter, in my opinion, in Washington, and it's probably the most fun place to be a press secretary or press flag in Washington. The rules were a little different this time around impeachment. You guys were boxed in a little bit more than usual. What was your take on that?
Part of it was a fallout from the Kavanaugh confirmation, where senators, and they were trying to cure the wrong problem because they were getting yelled at by constituents who were in the Senate office buildings across the street, and they basically imposed, mostly through Mitch McConnell's office, a lot of restrictions of movement, and there were these rope lines that kind of looked almost like a Hollywood nightclub where paparazzi would line up to go see who Brad Pitt's dating now.
I thought you were going to say me.
Yeah, no, paparazzi wouldn't care. And so you couldn't move around. We had a metal detector, a magnometer that we had to walk through to get into the Senate gallery up above the Senate, where I've been going for 20 years or more, and it was the first time we ever had to go through we already walked through 1 or 2 sets of magnometers to get into the congressional complex, and then there was this last one. It was explained by one senator that they were kind of afraid of us leaving listening devices behind. And I looked at them and I'm like, I'm not capable of that type of technology.
That's like MacGyver stuff.
I
Like,
can't-
yeah, like we can really do that.
I mean,
And then they didn't go into closed session anyway.
Yeah, so
Do you
it
think
was,
that that's going to continue? Do you
no,
think-
it's not going to continue because they cannot afford it. The Capitol Police, which is its own police force, there were, the men and women that I know were telling me, on average, they were getting 40 hours of overtime per week during the trial. So they loved it. The cops kind of loved it.
I said to the cops, I go, so you guys going to Bermuda when this is done? And they're like, well, I'm going to definitely pay off some bills.
Yeah.
You know? But it was, part of it was to make it uncomfortable for us and to keep us from easily getting to people who didn't want to talk about impeachment.
Yeah.
You got a bunch of Senate Republicans taking some tough votes, and they wanted to keep us away from them. It doesn't really work in the long term, but I think it'll go away for now, but I do think if there's a Supreme Court vacancy, this was a trial run for
God.
exactly
Yeah.
how they're going to do it. It's just, for us to be cracked down like that, it's just, I told some senators, I go, come on, we work here every day. That was like they don't trust us, and we're not going to sneak around with microphones or anything.
Yeah,
So,
and I mean,
it was unfortunate.
there are very professional people inside the Capitol Police who are running security threats, and they know which members of Congress are getting legitimate threats, and they will then provide security detail based on that. So it wasn't, we weren't security threats.
Yeah, and everybody saw the famous Jeff Flake confrontation over the Supreme Court, but that was in another building where you get to go see your senator if you want to go see them, so.
Do you think a part of it was encountering senators who not only were going to face difficult questions, but also something you mentioned earlier was that the Senate is not known for exactly youth throughout its ranks, and some of these hearings went late. Do you think there was an effort to protect aging senators from
Answering
late
tough
in the
questions.
day after hours and hours and hours of testimony?
I don't know, they're all so old, I don't even know if they think that way, because they're like, well, that's just what I'm doing. But there was a unnamed senator, I guess I would say, who got a little confused under questioning, and there was a false report about where she was coming down on.
Oh, yeah.
So, it does happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't want to monopolize the
Yeah, well,
conversation.
we've
We'd
got a
love to get
question.
some questions.
So I was 20 years ago in my senior seminar here at Villanova and studied media and politics, and we watched the 2000 campaign through the eyes of all the different newspapers, PBS, NBC, Nightly News, etc., to try to see how coverage of campaigns impacted people's views of them. And this morning I was listening to NPR, and they had an article or a conversation about an article in the Atlantic about disinformation, about how that has become so prevalent. And so in 20 years, you guys are part of the established media, and you guys dominate. 20 years ago, you dominated how people viewed politics. And now there's all these other sources of information that impact the way people perceive politics. And, I trust your papers, and I don't trust them. So I'm interested, number one, in sort of internally amongst the trade, what's the discussion about how what you're doing is becoming marginalized by all of this other noise that's out there? And then sort of relatedly, 20 years later, I'm the father of 4, and my kids are talking about and beginning to talk about and consume information, and I'm realizing, like, they're getting it from all these sources that are not trustworthy, and it's influencing them. And I'm saying, you got to put the apps on, the New York Times, the Washington Post on your phone. I'll pay for your subscriptions, and I'll send you this information. But relatedly, are people in your industry thinking about how do we make ourselves relevant to that generation, and how do we as a culture, try to create, teach people how to consume information, because in some ways I think we're all brainwashing ourselves with whatever it is that makes sense in the moment. And I think from a media perspective, I'd just be really interested in your perspective on those two.
Yeah, so let me go first before I forget everything you said. But all you need to know about 2000 is, where I was stationed election night 2000? Tallahassee. So I was right there for the whole thing and got stuck there. So the Times were really doing a lot on this, honestly. A lot. And from a story perspective, one of the things we do now is, like Eric Lipton, who's a big investigative reporter for us, we post the whole documentation of whatever story we're doing. That all goes online. So people can look at it themselves. I'm involved with this thing called the News Literacy Project, which I think is directly related to your question, where they're developing curriculum for school kids, like middle school and high school kids, to how to go through information and find the right source of things. So there's a lot going on there. We talk about this constantly at work. How do we gain trust of people? And a lot of that is transparency. We're trying to be as transparent as we can. Now, do we dominate the whole news like we used to? No, but we're being read by more people than have ever been read in the history of the paper, and it just keeps going up. So I think that there's a lot happening in this area, but I think it's tough, and you really have to work at it. And I think you haven't seen nothing yet, as they say, in terms of this election and what's going to happen in terms of disinformation. I read that Atlantic story today about the Trump campaign and what they're doing, and it's like really enlightening. but the technology is going so fast. How do we keep up with that, right? You can make anything into a video now and make it look real. So we're working at it, but it's going to be tough, and it's going to require people like you and all you folks in here, and this isn't a partisan thing. It's like you have to get your kids and your relatives to pay attention and quit passing around phony information, which everybody does, right? Oh, look at this. I mean, I got caught on a faux tweet years ago on something. It was actually involved Rudy Giuliani, of all people. And I just retweeted something, and then, wow, that was wrong. I basically investigate everything that I look at to try and validate it, because it's so crazy out there. But I really am high on this thing called the News Literacy Project. If you can get they're raising a lot of money. Marty Barron, your boss, is extremely involved in that. And it's like, this is the kind of thing we're going to have to do. We got to teach people how to consume news, because it didn't used to be this way.
I got caught on most of you, I think, will love this. Certain non-Eagles fans won't. The time I tweeted and commented on what turned out to be a fake tweet was the most depressing of all. It was a Twitter account that looked exactly like, I cannot remember if it was 3, 6, or 10, if it was like at WCAU, at whatever. And it was an announcement that the Eagles, that next season, were going to go back to the Kelly green uniforms. I just tweeted like, yes, fly Eagles fly, it's about time. And then somebody tweeted back like, dude, that's the fake local news account. I was so depressed.
Maybe they should have a Peterson green now.
Oh, yes. Or just a statue of Nick Foles, like he's catching the pass. But to Carl's point, though, we have not, we're both our organizations, other news organizations, Politico. We now know more about our readers than we ever have before, and we get to survey them in ways that isn't just a phone call saying, "Do you plan to vote for so and so?" And when we did this massive study a couple of years ago, they expected the biggest complaint to be about copy editing and misidentifying somebody from Pennsylvania who's actually from Colorado, and you get mistakes wrong, this and that. The number one complaint easily was transparency and telling us what things were and knowing this is an opinion piece. And you now, if you go to the Washington Post website and you look at a story and you see my name, it'll be in a different color. If you hover over my name, it'll pop out a bio box and explain who I am, how long I've covered Congress, where I'm from. And it's to try to let readers know and gain trust. Like, hey, this guy's really old. He's kind of done this a while. Maybe you should trust him. So that's been a real thing, and that's what we have to do. But we are being read by more people than ever before. There is a hunger out there, but it is just in a sea of expletives.
I think the next few months are going to be a big test, right? And then you have Facebook, right, which is saying, well, hands off. We're gonna let that go. Is that the right thing to do? I don't know enough about their business model or anything, but it's kind of scary. I think that we're at a trying time for this. We're trying to conquer it, but it's going to take some more.
I've got a question for Carl. What do you think about the Times endorsement? Have you heard a lot about
You know,
it?
that's a separate section of the paper.
I know,
Just want to say,
You've got opinions.
we took a beating for that. I don't know.
Explain it. Make sure everybody
So
knows.
there was a double endorsement, and they did it. And they, what's that?
And the fixing of bread prices.
Benjamin Applebaum.
And then we
And you can talk about what you're hearing. I'm curious what kind of feedback you're getting as well.
it depends what section of the paper you're in.
Right.
This is actually being live streamed, so I have to kind of be careful. I think there was a lot of people who thought maybe that wasn't the way to go. A double endorsement. I don't even know if paper.
They
So we
endorsed
endorsed
both.
Amy Klobuchar and Elizabeth Warren, not a standard newspaper endorsement where you usually pick one.
Kind of the point of the.
Well, I honestly, I tried. I kind of understood their reasoning a little. You know, we're trying to do things differently, and that was different.
If there was some
the delegates, yeah.
Particularly if there's a Sanders plurality, what do you think is likely to ensue?
Chaos, mayhem. I mean, it'll be, in this scenario, it's just that 3 or 4 people keep going along all the way through April, May. Pennsylvania's primary, I think, is the last Tuesday in April, and there's a big, like, 3 or 4 week gap between the March primaries in Pennsylvania. And it could make, like, you guys make it sick of this primary. If it's still going strong, you could have 3 or 4 people. You think you're seeing a lot of Mike Bloomberg ads now? Holy cow. But if they remain in it, and, you know, Bernie has 38% of the delegates, and Buttigieg has 29%, and Bloomberg has, help me with the math.
Well,
I
he
don't
would
know,
have
four-
some.
Yeah, and
Amy, maybe?
The Bernie people will believe that he has finished first. And if you take the nomination away from him, you're part of the rigged establishment of millionaires and billionaires that are rigging things. The rest of the party will say, no, you got 36% of the vote. You're barely 1/3, and we got together and picked so-and-so. I think that type of convention would be a massive blow-up, and that's why, as reporters, we always dream of this, because it's like, wow, 4 days of chaos.
Back in the day, you know.
I mean, in a lot of ways, it would be similar to what we were expecting. We almost got there in 2016
Yeah.
in the Republican primary.
But it had,
In fact,
Yeah.
Trump hired Paul Manafort to come on board to help
Yeah.
get through a potential broker convention, because he was the only one who had lived through one.
and he
worked
was a
through one
delegate
before.
expert.
Yeah.
So
He had
turned out
worked in
great for
76.
both of them. So just a little bit on your question, though, but here's what the fear is in Washington about Bernie Sanders, who both Paul and I have covered for decades, is that, and this is not a knock on Bernie, honestly, but what they're worried about is their own majorities in the House and Senate. And the seats they have to win are the middle-of-the-road-ish seats. Bernie is a socialist. You saw the State of the Union. You see the ads. Socialist, socialist, socialist. Democrats are actually, they're just worried about that. They're worried about it at the presidential level, but what they're really worried about it is at their congressional level, that they think that could really cost them. Right now, I would say House Democrats, correct me if I'm wrong, are pretty confident that they can hold on. And maybe even because of some of the seats coming open in Texas and some places where they can win, they're pretty confident. But that makes them less confident. So I think if you got to a convention that no one had really won, that would be a big scene. But it does usually shake out.
So staying on Sanders for just 1 second, I actually saw the preview of the upcoming Hillary Clinton documentary on Hulu. And she made some news when it was first...
That nobody likes Bernie.
That nobody likes Bernie. And it's clear in watching a couple episodes of this that she doesn't like Bernie. very
Yeah,
much.
she really doesn't like Bernie.
But you guys have been around the Capitol for a long time. You talk to members more than most people ever will in their lives. How accurate is that statement? What is the view of Bernie in the caucus?
So he was in the House for 14, maybe like 20 years. I might be wrong on that. He won his Senate seat in 2006 from Vermont. Vermont, by the way, is a very strange place, even though it's very liberal. It has only elected one actual Democrat to the Senate ever, the current senior senator, Pat Leahy.
Who's been there
since 1974. And so Sanders has been in the Senate for 13 years. He's not, I think she takes it too far to say nobody likes him, but he's always been kind of the iconoclastic guy in the corner who's saying what we should really do is universal health care, single payer, and he sort of is fighting for causes, and he's not building bridges. Teddy Kennedy was, as liberal as you could be, but got things done because he figured out which Republicans he could work with, advance the ball a little bit each day was his motto. Bernie has just been more of a standoffish guy in the corner who everybody kind of likes because he's true to his word. But when it comes to building legislation, I think the most important thing he did was a 2014 veterans bill with John McCain. He's just not somebody who has made like real friendships in terms of working on legislation and getting things done. When he announced for president in 2015, he did it on the lawn outside the Capitol.
Only after being told he couldn't do it in the Senate radio TV
Yes.
gallery.
It was a little
which
bit-
they don't allow.
Yeah, it was like taxpayer funded. You
Yeah.
go outside, it's not taxpayer funded. And there was nobody there, except reporters and a couple of his staff. And it's amazing to think
That's true.
in less than 5 years, he has gone from a guy who had not one supporter at his presidential announcement to the frontrunner.
He's a little flinty, you know. He's very driven. I mean, he's genuine about what he's pushing. He's not somebody who's doing this for political expediency. He believes everything that he says, you know, and he wants it, and he thinks it's right. I will say in the House, and this all goes to Paul, he was a guy who worked by amendment. He would always have amendments, right? So how do you do amendments? You do them on your own. And so he would have his amendment. He got some passed. But he has really, really developed a following. And, you know, I had a son who went to Burlington, UVM, so, you know, familiar with up there. And, you know, he's caught on with a younger voter who I remember so far back, they like to stick it to the establishment. Bernie's the guy that they're using to stick it to him, but it's really making the party nervous.
I would love to hear what you guys, if you could wave a magic wand and change the way that media is absorbed today. You know, the candidates that are getting the attention and the popularity, Trump, Bloomberg, they are brilliant at the sound bites and the message, being the villain or creating the villain, the good guy, bad guy. It's the entertainment factor. It has nothing to do with whether or not they have the qualifications to do that job. Trump is an entertainer, and he's brought all that he understands about reality TV to the media and his persona across many people's perception of him. So, you know, perfect example, the impeachment situation. He didn't care if they investigated Biden. He just wanted a soundbite. He wanted somebody of importance to throw out the soundbite, and then it will get wings, it will get legs, and that's all he needs. So, the 24/7 news cycle on cable news, like, they will continue to repeat those sound bites, even if they're not true. I mean, you hear it all the time, and the president responded, and they repeat the sound bite. How are we ever going to get back to a point where we can, you know, trust what we're hearing?
Well, that was really depressing. Want to go first?
The transformation of, I preface this by saying, I love our cousins in cable news. Both of us sometimes appear on cable news shows, but cable news has just become the oxygen and the steroids of intense partisanship. And it is, you know, 20 years ago, cable news, prime time, most of their shows were actually more legal crime drama. It was more about MSNBC had a guy named Dan Abrams who was like, find that murder, you know, find the missing girl. Joan Benet Ramsey had as much to do with the rise of cable news as O.J. Simpson, and that's what they focused on. Remember car chases? They used to, you know, Friday afternoon it'd be slow, and there'd be a car chase in L.A. and helicopters, and boom, all of a sudden Fox, MSNBC, and CNN would all have them on. We're the car chase now. Politics, Congress, the presidency is the car chase. It's just 24/7, and it really has an echo effect in how the politicians, communicate with their primary voters. You know, we watched during the impeachment trial, the 4 senators who they're now down to three, would run down at breaks to go to a bank of TVs, and Amy Klobuchar was just trying to get on MSNBC as much as possible so voters in Iowa and New Hampshire would see her. I don't know what the solution is. The News Literacy Project might help, but it is. Go.
Yeah. You know, reality TV, you want to see the genius of Trump, all you needed to do was watch the State of the Union. That was a bravura performance of reality TV. Medal to Rush, which was a super provocative act. You know, the returning soldier, the girl with it was
The
straight
scholarship.
out, yeah, with
the
the
girl, she was
scholarship.
from Philadelphia.
Yeah,
The
the
Tuskegee
girl with
Airmen.
the scholarship. I mean, we were all just sitting there and our jaws were just
It's
dropping.
the Truman Show.
Yeah, well, and it's real. I agree with Paul, everything he said about, this started with, not to impugn Crossfire, but all the McLaughlin group, right, which is still on, by the way, if anyone realized that. And just the combat of politics. And it's been, I will say that we're in a money-making capitalistic enterprise here. So you want to do things that make money and draw audience, and so that's behind a lot of it. So I wrote this book last year about judicial confirmation fights, and the last chapter of the book, as I said this earlier today, I didn't mean it to be so, but a lot of people who read it, where I talk about here's what's going on, here's where I see the problems, I'm not seeing any solutions, and people go, wow, it was so depressing at the end. I'm like, I wish I could be more upbeat. I'm not seeing a big improvement over the horizon of something that's going to suddenly draw us all together and get all the media united. The media is benefiting from being in the middle of this political combat. So we got to take some responsibility too. I think at the New York Times, Washington Post, we do a very responsible job. I know that people take a lot of issue with what we do, like the editorial endorsement, and obviously we do some things wrong, but man, this country is just in a big fight right now, and I'm not seeing light at the end of the tunnel.
Also, I think part of the challenge is over the last 20 years, people are conflating journalism that you guys do each and every day with late-night cable hosts or other forms of I would say, political entertainment.
Yeah, and the big problem is the silo.
Or even confusing what you do on a daily basis with your editorial board and what they're writing, which they're supposed to give their opinions and take a lean either way. And that's all been pushed into this big giant blob that's easily thrown around.
No, and the people are watching what, feeds their own biases. So that's also bad. You should be watching what the other folks are saying, right? Maybe that opens up the mind, but I think we're in for a bit of a rough time right now. Sorry.
Yeah, hi. I mean, we're all naturally focused on the top of the ticket, but it is the redistricting cycle. So what I'm wondering is, as
Gerrymandering.
the Trumpists and the
We're your guys.
Republican side, and the moderate Dems and the liberals on the Democratic side, the internal civil war, one, who's winning on each side, and then as far as candidate selection and fundraising for, Senate, Congress, State House, governors, like the undercard, basically, who's doing well in the undercard and why? Is basically
Well,
the question.
just gerrymandering is one of my favorite topics, and so Elbridge Gerry, who is the father of gerrymandering, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, he's actually buried in Congressional Cemetery on Capitol Hill, the only signer of the Declaration who's buried there. And I don't know if you guys know anything about Congressional Cemetery, but it was in real disrepair, and they started to make money by letting people pay to let their dogs run in there. So I would always take my dog in there and go over he's got a big grave, but unfortunately my dog would always pee on the side of it, so it's sort of unfortunate. But here's what's going on that's related to that, and we do have a round of redistricting. I think one of the big outcomes of 2018 was a lot of Democratic control of legislatures and governorships where they're going to be overseeing what's happened in American politics at the congressional House level and state legislatures is that the fights have come not trying to resolve the Democrat and Republican disputes, but the Republican disputes and the Democrat disputes. Districts are too safe, so the fight is within the party that pulls people to the extreme, in each party. You're seeing right now, the Republicans have been dealing with this for a while. Democrats are now facing, that's how AOC got in Congress, because she challenged an incumbent. There's all sorts of incumbents, very powerful senior members. I think of Richie Neal from Massachusetts, chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, just cut the big trade deal. He's being challenged from the left. A lot of challenges from the left. So that is not a formula for finding common ground when the parties are pulling themselves apart.
Yeah. In terms of just the partisan edge, you know, the last redrawing was an epic disaster for Democrats because they had
In this state, for sure,
the
right.
2010 election just wiped out Democrats all the way down to state legislative and town municipalities, and it put them at a huge disadvantage. Since then, and especially with the 2018 bounce back, they're heading into it. They're still at a disadvantage. Republicans control more legislatures and governors' mansions completely over in terms of drawing the map, but it's much better. And in Pennsylvania here, the state Supreme Court took care of that in a ruling that really benefited Democrats congressionally and making them go back to maps where the counties themselves are more often than not the lines. You know, one of my older sisters lives in North Wales, and to drive from her house to my brother Matt's place, you would drive in and out of the same two districts 6 different times. That's been wiped out in Pennsylvania, and it was a big help for Democrats. So, you know, there are a few more governor's races up in 2020, and state legislative races. Texas would be the biggest one. If Texas is competitive on the presidential level, there's an outside chance Democrats could win back one of those 2 legislatures there, and that would be a game-changing moment for Democrats where they could redraw those lines, and all of a sudden Texas might be, in terms of the 30, it's going to be 38 or 39 they send to Congress in 2021. They might be able to have almost half, but there's a long way between now and November.
So think about it this way. Say you're Cory Gardner, for instance, just to throw a name out there, running in Colorado for re-election, tough state. You're in the impeachment fight. Maybe you kind of think Trump did something wrong, but are you going to go take on Trump? What, that's just going to immediately get you a primary from the right? No. So it really influences the way legislators act. And I think, you know, maybe I'm a daydreamer, but I think nonpartisan redistricting is the way to go. They're doing it in some states. It's never completely nonpartisan. There's always some little way to influence it, but I think it works better. I do.
We have time for one more question.
And we'll stand around
We can
afterward.
We're actually gonna, we have a reception afterwards downstairs in the Curly Exchange, which would be a great time to ask more questions.
Just given the division within the Democratic Party when it comes to the 2020 nominee, do you think the GOP is liking their chances to get Trump reelected, or are they equally as nervous?
I didn't hear it.
She's asking about the Trump reelection. We did a segment earlier today with the journalism students, and it was the exact same final question.
I'm not going to.
We had to
We're not going to
predict.
give you as specific an answer as we did in an
Yeah.
off-the-record one.
Yeah. I'll say this, trying to tie every topic together. Last Tuesday night, State of the Union, Carl and I were sitting about 3 or 4 seats apart from here to Brad, probably up above, in the gallery above. And throughout that 78 minutes or whatever, the look on the Democrats' faces as it was all sinking in. They had, a year earlier, they were literally dancing. They had just won back the majority, the most women ever elected. They were wearing white in honor of the suffragettes. And there was a moment where Trump nodded to that a year ago, and they got up and started dancing. I was like, I have never seen that. 1 year later, the economy is still going strong. The Iowa caucus was just an epic disaster for Democrats. Trump was coming in that night at his highest poll ratings ever. and they knew that 4 o'clock the next day, he was going to be acquitted in a vote, that everybody knew, God, he's really going to own this one on us. And then he did that State of the Union, the reality show version. And the look on their faces, the Democrats, was just pure fear and fury. They were angry as heck. Several of them got up and walked out in protest, and the rest of them just had this look of anger and fear, and I think that was the symbolic ripping up of the, not so symbolic, she did it, she ripped up the speech. And I think that was done out of fear and fury, because it sunk into them that night, that moment, in a way it had not sunk in before, that he could really get reelected.
I'll lean in a little more.
Let me just say that he did everything but roll out the door number 3 in that State of the Union speech. I think he's definitely the favorite at this moment, and it's because he's the president, right?
Oh, yeah.
And they've learned a lot the last time, and they're not going to do some of that stuff. But I think this election is not over. I think there's a long way to go. Trump really struggles with women, suburban women in particular. There's a lot that could happen, honestly.
Yeah, but if you put Trump, all the characteristics of Trump aside for a moment, and you just look at the power of the incumbency in an election, you look at the state of the economy, and depending on the poll you're looking at, anywhere from 60 to 70 people feel good about the state of the economy. And really, if you look at the massive financial advantage that he is bringing against any one of the potential Democratic nominees.
Except Bloomberg.
Except Bloomberg. He's had a lead start to organize in a lot of these places. So Bloomberg is a bit of a wild card in that regard, but just he's structurally set up to win before you even get to the Trump aspect of it. So I think
I think that's right. I do. But like I said earlier, volatility is the characteristic of our politics right now. And it used to be everything was locked in by Labor Day, and now you wonder if it's even locked in the day before Election Day.
So, my name is Mark Caden. I'm the chair of the Villanova Public Policy Council. So before I just say a quick word of thanks to all 3 of you, I'd just like to make one comment about the council, because there's a lot of the commentary. It sort of leaves us with sort of a depressing feel, right? Like how we can
Sorry.
the conflict of the piece. But I think as we think about kind of what we do in careers of public policy, the way I think about it at least, there have been challenging times in this country. In all of those moments, in the Civil War, there was Abraham Lincoln, there was, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had John F. Kennedy, and to help us get out of the Great Depression, there was FDR. To help cure some of the malaise and drive some economic growth, we had Ronald Reagan. And I think the way that we think about careers in public policy, we think about like firefighters at 9/11, right? They didn't look at the challenges with burning flames and buildings. They ran into it to save their fellow citizens, right? And so what we are trying to do, particularly in light of the environment, particularly in light of the challenges, really create new pathways for people to pursue careers in public policy. Because at the foundation of our democracy, it is a citizen-led government. And so Paul, Jonathan, Alex Del Pizzo, myself, we spent all day today with the staff of the Arts and Sciences, Chris Kowalski, who's been our sort of godfather Sherpa within the university, Adele Lindenmeyer was there, is really thinking about how do we create more internships? How do we create more stipends for those internships? How do we encourage, particularly those students within College of Arts and Sciences, to pursue and achieve the kinds of success in your career that Paul, Carl, Brad, Jonathan, Paul, Alex, and others within the council can do. So what I would encourage all of you, particularly the students, obviously parents, alumni, is we are very much interested in helping you pursue careers in public policy. whether that's in Washington and state capitals, and so take advantage of the resources. Villanova on the Hill, that was mentioned at the outset, Villanova Mini-Mester, internship program through the Career Center. Like, we need good young people to pursue careers. And I think on behalf of the university and the advisory council, we have a small token of our appreciation. The depth of thoughtfulness, the years of experience that all three of you had was extraordinary. I know I learned a ton. So on behalf of all of us, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.